a physical realm?
Well, according to Max Planck, that's a great question, George. And according to Max Planck, the answer is no, we wouldn't, because Planck is saying that, and this is such a huge concept. He's saying that it's from this stuff, this non-conventional form of energy. It doesn't work the way we would expect energy normally to work, and that's why it's taken so long, scientists so long to validate it with our equipment.
Yeah.
But he said it's from this stuff that all physical matter originates. He says all matter originates and exists only by virtue of this force. So from his quantum perspective, 1944, what he's suggesting is if the field weren't there, that we couldn't have physical matter. It's the framework upon which the physical matter is actually hung, if we want to think of that in a visual sense.
That's incredible. Now, but how do we know it exists?
Well,
we can't see it.
Precisely. We can't see it, and we've been hard-pressed to measure it because it is what's called a non-conventional field of energy. It doesn't respond to conventional methods of testing, to conventional electronic equipment. And there was a tremendous controversy back in the late 1800s, George, among scientists and philosophers and engineers as to whether or not this field actually existed, and a lot of heated debate. And there was a very famous experiment. It was first conducted in 1881 behind closed doors by a team, Michelson and Morley, and it was reproduced at Case Western University in 1887.
Well, they surely didn't have any technology, really, did they?
Well, you know, if you've got the concept right, George, you don't have to have some real advanced technology. If the concept is correct, there are ways to detect the field. But in my estimation, this was a good experiment. I think it was poorly interpreted, and what it's now called is history's greatest failed experiment.
All right, tell us what they were doing.
Well, let me just give an analogy. If our listeners right now were to walk out of their homes or offices or cars, wherever they're listening to this broadcast, if they moistened their index finger and held it above their head, and in the moment that they were holding their moistened finger above their head, they felt no wind against their finger. And from not feeling any wind against their finger, if they concluded that no air exists, that is the equivalent of the Michelson-Morley experiment. And we know that just because you don't feel wind in that moment doesn't mean the air isn't there. It's just not moving.
Exactly.
Well, the belief was that this field, if it in fact existed, there would be a motion. It was called the ether wind, and the field was called the ether at that time.
All right.
And because their equipment detected no motion in 1881 and then again in 1887, and these experiments, by the way, were published in the open literature, and I've put the references up on the website, and as we go through the evening, I can give the number of the references if people want to look these up on their own. But they were published in the American Journal of Science, 1887, volume 34. And what they said, they concluded in 1887, they said this field doesn't exist, George. And from that moment until the late 20th century, as good as our science and our physics have been and as well as they've served us, we have been operating on the belief that everything is separate from everything else, that this stuff doesn't connect everything in the universe, and what happens in point A has no effect on what happens in point B, and if it looks like it does, it was just a coincidence. And now we have found ourselves in a place, in the quantum world, where the mysteries of quantum material have pushed scientists to do the experiments and to find the field exists. Now, what's really interesting is that the same experiment was repeated again almost 100 years later, and it was in 1986. And this is the one reference I don't have up on the website, so I'm going to give it to our listeners. So
sure,
they can
and then tell us what happened, too.
Sure. It was conducted by a gentleman named E.W. Silvertooth. He was working on behalf of the United States Air Force.
E.W. Silvertooth?
Silvertooth.
All right.
He was working on behalf of the Air Force at the time. He repeated the experiment. He had better equipment, and lo and behold, George, he found not only did this field exist, but it existed within the parameters that were predicted 100 years earlier. It acted just the way Michelson and Morley believed that it would have with their equipment. He published this study in a very prestigious journal, Nature, volume 322, August 14th, 1986, page 590, and it messes everything up. And people, a lot of scientists just don't like to talk about it. The fact is, the experiment was repeated. It showed that this field is there, and it's led to a number of other experiments. And we can talk about those tonight.
Does this matrix allow us to have intuition, to be able to tap into the psychic realm, to be able to have telepathy between people we really connect with?
George, this is where it gets really relevant in our lives. Not only does it allow for these things, the belief now it is because this field is there that these things work the way they work, and beyond remote viewing. When we're seeing halfway around the world or in another world from our living room, what is the conduit? We've got to ask ourselves, what is the conduit that is carrying our conscious awareness from point A to point B?
And what takes it there?
Yeah, we'll talk about some miraculous healings tonight. What we found is that there's a quality of human emotion that every human on the face of the earth is capable of. It's just a little shift in perception, and this quality of emotion literally will allow the stuff in this field to conform to what we feel in our hearts. So when we feel the feeling of the healing of a cancerous tumor, in the example I'm going to give later tonight, we can actually see inside the body of a living woman, through an ultrasound, we can see her cancerous tumor disappear in the presence of 3 practitioners trained to hone this language of feeling in their bodies, and the field is the conduit that is carrying what they feel inside their bodies into the world around them. It's documented in Eastern traditions, and when I show this to medical people here in the West, George, they chalk it up to an anomaly and a miracle.
Do you think if you concentrate on this matrix, if you truly meditate about it, it puts you into it? You can go into it?
You're already in it, George. What we know is that it's not that it's out there somewhere. It's the stuff that holds everything together. Every cell in your body and my body and all of our listeners has emerged from the substrate of this matrix. It's what's holding us together right now. It's impossible not to be in this divine matrix. And what the scientists found in 1909, in their time, and what physicists like Dr. John Wheeler are saying today, not only are we part of it, it's impossible for us to be passive observers within this field. If we're conscious, if we are awake, we are always interacting and creating within this field, although we may not be conscious of what it is that we're creating. And that's part of our mastery that was described in 5,000-year-old texts. How we create, it's not a verbal language. It's the power of human emotion, George, and it's the very power that has been discouraged by males in the West for the last 400 years, 1,700 years.
Well, I was going to say, if people don't believe it, are they going to be able to get in it and use it?
They're already in it. And,
right.
and it's not, the beauty is it's not something that we even have to believe. The studies, the experiments are solid. They're showing that this is there. They're showing that we affect this field through. Let me just back up a little bit.
I'll tell you what, why don't you hold that thought?
Sure. Okay.
We're going to take this break. Gregg Braden's website, Gregg Braden, BRADEN.com, linked up at coasttocoastam.com. We're talking about his work, The Divine Matrix. We'll be back. Okay, just mark your calendar, those of you who live around the Austin, Texas area, because on the 27th, I'll be at KLBJ's Talk Fest in Austin of this month. We'll do a little book signing right after that before I got to pop on a plane, but should be a fun event. And I think Friday night, they've got a contest going on with a dinner with me. So far, no one has entered the contest. No, I'm kidding. But you just call the station, KLBJ, listen to them, because they're talking about it every day. But I'll be out there next week, and we'll do a program out of there on Friday night with Linda Moulton Howe and Alex Jones. So that'll be a fun coast-to-coast show. And welcome back to Coast to Coast. George Norrie with you. Gregg Braden, our very special guest tonight. Greg, let's pick up where we left off, if you want.
Sure. George, just before the break, we were just talking about the role that this field plays in the universe and the role we play within the field. And One of the things that's fascinating to me is, and especially as a former senior computer systems designer,